I think that to a certain degree, there's a certain amount of incentive to keep the system somewhat broken to allow people to come and work in the US undocumented because it creates a permanent underclass of people who can be exploited and underpaid. And there's many industries in the US, especially in hospitality and construction, and there's others, but that rely on that labor to keep their costs down. So it's just the inconvenient truth that I don't know if either side is really going to go all the way, and if comprehensive immigration reform is just a political talking point for election season, and then, after that, it sort of disappears every time.
Dies
But
down.
that's
Yeah.
been the way it's always been in the United States, period, not just within the last few decades or whatever it is. There's always just sort of been this gap.
Hello, welcome back. I'm Andreea Parc, and this is a live again podcast, a podcast where attorneys and other professionals meet to discuss real life challenges and how our decisions shaped our journeys. Alexa, my co host, is not with us today because she's preparing for two major fashion shows at the beginning of September. And we cannot wait to share with you what she's been doing. And that's the reason why I'm alone today. But we have a fantastic guest, Mr. Pablo Velez. He's an attorney, managing attorney and partner with Velez and Cipriano, PLLC. His practice encompasses of areas of immigration law with emphasis on business and family immigration. Mr. Velez has represented and assisted international and domestic businesses, professionals, and individuals from all over the world in a successful filing and petitioning of various immigrant and non-immigrant visas for corporations, families, and investors. He also has significant experience with refugee matters, especially with asylum cases, and has represented clients in removal proceedings before the United States Immigration Court. Thank you so much, Pablo, for being here with us. It's such a pleasure to have you.
No, thank you very much for having me.
It was a pleasure to meet you about 2, 3 weeks ago at an event. I wanted very much to have you as a guest in our podcast, especially that I have practiced immigration law for a while. And it's very emotional for me to have another immigration attorney here with us. So thank you very much for taking the time.
Looking forward to the conversation.
Let's start with what's now important in the news. I would like for you to share with our listeners, what do you think that President Trump ideas on immigration and what he would really want to accomplish with this?
Sure. So the first thing I want to say is that we have to be very careful with how we interpret what's said on the media. The reason being is that it's highly politicized, and since 2016, I would argue, has very strong inclinations to one side or another. So depending on what affiliate you're listening to, you're going to get a very skewed version of what's happening. So I think in order to sort of get the clearest picture, you almost have to either digest the most material from all sides or stick to print journalism, which actually is a little bit more thoughtful and less sensational in that sense. Is just my opinion on the matter. But, just in general, we've already seen a first Trump administration, and that there's sort of this very nationalistic view of how immigration should play out, a very fervent, let's say, enthusiasm for enforcing the border, maybe even inferring, going a little bit further, that certain people are specifically being kept out. Without getting too political about things, I think that we've seen just by the actions that ICE has been taking over the last few months, portrayed on all sides of the media that they are aggressively enforcing immigration law against anyone that they're able to. I think that there's also a bit of sensationalism into how many people. So, for example, the Obama administration, although they didn't necessarily put it front and center of their agenda, deported quite a few more people than the previous Bush administration did. So, this isn't necessarily an issue of who's liberal, who's conservative. It's just about the focus and what kind of message they want to send. And then another thing to think about is who are these people that they're actually going after sort of on a larger scale. So on a regular basis, they don't really have the resources because Homeland Security is one of the poorest funded government agencies there are. And as a matter of fact, 95% of the USCIS budget, which is immigration, is brought in by the filing fees that are paid by the folks who actually use the system. So it's a little bit laughable to think that sort of all of this enforcement is going to be manageable fiscally. It's not something that they can afford really. So what's happening is that there's a very targeted approach, even though it doesn't seem that way. It's very targeted. They know exactly who they're going after for the most part. There are exceptions, and there are notable exceptions in the media, as we've seen the gentleman from Columbia University and the gentleman who was sent to El Salvador, who is potentially going to be sent to Uganda. There are exceptions, but for the most part, there is what we would call low-hanging fruit, like folks who already have existing deportation orders issued by immigration judges who are still in the country because it's very simple to evade one of those orders if one is not detained immediately after an immigration judgment. They simply move, and again, because of the lack of resources that Homeland Security has, it's very difficult for them to find someone if they just change addresses. So they're going after a lot of those folks. They're going after a lot of people who are working in certain industries that historically have been known to hire many undocumented workers. They're targeting those as well. They're also just using other government agency databases to find out who, for example, with the IRS, they want to know who's been paying taxes, but who's been using a tax ID number as opposed to a social security number, because it's a very easy way to tell if someone who's been working unauthorized in the United States. So, the examples go on, but there is sort of the takeaway message is to sort of look at all sides and come up with a conclusion that sort of represents every angle.
Yeah. I remember it was probably 2014 when I wrote an article about what you just mentioned. President Obama was called deporter in chief because of the extreme number of deportations. So, what you're saying is that President Trump deportations are not even close to President Obama.
It's, at the rate that they're going, it may get there. And I don't know if the administration sort of has the Obama administration's numbers as a target to hit and are creating some kind of a quota system. I wouldn't be shocked, but they're not quite there yet. And I think, just my opinion, that they'll run out of resources before they're able to sort of endeavor into what they purport to want to do. But a lot of these characters that you're seeing in the Trump administration, at least from the enforcement standpoint, have been around since the Obama administration. For example, Tom Homan, who Trump calls his border czar, was an Obama administration appointee and was working under President Obama. So this is someone who, despite what you may think of him politically, has been seen by both sides as very competent at doing his particular job.
Yeah.
Depending on what the parameters of that are is a different story, but that you're dealing with someone who's not necessarily a zealot. This is someone who has been in government for quite a while and who understands how to achieve objectives. So it'll be interesting to see how it plays out over a longer term.
You mentioned the media, and there are so many news, and people get scared. Can you please, for the normal American, are there any risks?
So it's a very difficult question because I can say from a legal standpoint and just speaking theoretically that anyone who's lawfully present in the US should have nothing to fear because they have a status and they have a way to prove the status, whether it be a citizen with a birth certificate or a US passport, whether it be a legal permanent resident with a green card, or someone with a work visa that has their visa and their passport or has the approval notice from USCIS that shows that it's current. The issue is what to do if caught in a situation where you're not necessarily able to negotiate your position at the moment with ICE officers. It's almost analogous to what you tell people who are accused of crimes when they deal with the police. The moment to deal with it is not at the moment of arrest. You have the right to remain silent and all the other different things. The important thing to do is if anyone feels that they are at risk, being that they're not in lawful status, because people who are in lawful status shouldn't have to fear walking the streets, even though you have these few examples of cases that happen unjustly. People shouldn't generally have that fear because it's not something that happens every day. And again, this is sort of the fault of the media and exploiting these stories and the administration relishing in that they're being exploited because it goes to their fear angle. But they shouldn't fear that. But people who are undocumented have a very reasonable fear of sticking their heads out in public. But that doesn't matter what administration's in power. The only
Yeah.
thing is that this one is a little bit more zealous. So the thing to do is know that you have to find immigration counsel who can guide you in terms of your particular situation and let you know what your options are so you know how to conduct yourself.
Thank you. And also, can you please explain our listeners the difference between an immigrant visa and a non-immigrant visa?
Sure, absolutely. That's a very important thing and distinction. So, an immigrant is someone who intends on remaining in the US permanently, whereas a non-immigrant is on a limited visa for a limited purpose. So, for example, non-immigrant visas, literally an alphabet soup of visa categories, and they all go by letters. So I'm being very literal about that. But you have everything from a B1, B2 tourist to an E2 investor to an H1B temporary worker. So there's quite a few categories there. Then you have immigrant visas, which are for folks who have somehow qualified to be legal permanent residents in the US, whether that be a family-based petition because they have immediate relatives who've sponsored them in, whether that be an investment-based petition because they've put in an exorbitant amount of money into the US economy through a business that was authorized to take it, or if they were sponsored by a company, for example, that is hiring their services permanently and has gone through the labor certification process through the Labor Department. Depending on which one of these status one holds, although all of them are eligible to be protected in the US and the non-immigrants protected through the expiration of their particular status, all of these people who have a specific status are protected. The ones who are not are what we would call undocumented, either because they came into the United States without being inspected by customs, or they simply let their lawful status expire and they've been accruing unlawful presence.
And of course, we understand the risks for those people.
Mhm.
Do you see a difference in risk between non-immigrant and immigrant? For example, somebody entering in the country as with a student visa or a tourist visa, would that be at more risk for being caught and or returned as a person who has a green card who travels?
So, generally speaking, a permanent resident or green card holder is going to be treated a little bit better at customs than a visa holder, for example, because these are folks who have gone through the process, are legal permanent residents. They live in the US, they just still hold only their country of origin's passport. So, for all intents and purposes, they are US nationals to a degree. It's just the fact that they're not yet citizens. So they are treated a bit better in terms of their intent to remain in the US. It's permanent, so that's kind of a non-issue, whereas customs will scrutinize more so than the green card holder, a non-immigrant intent on staying here, for example. Depending on how many times this person has come in on what status and several other factors, they may be interrogated to a certain degree that becomes uncomfortable. And if a particular officer is not convinced by their answers, they will pull them into secondary inspection where they'll actually search them. And there is no Fourth Amendment right in secondary inspection, so they can go through your phone, they can read your messages, they can go through your bags, they can go through your belongings. You have no right to an attorney, you have no right to complain. If you do resist at any point, they can just detain you. So that's when it becomes a little bit different than the situation where a green card holder, for the most part, is just asked how long they've been out of the US, and as long as they haven't exceeded 180 days, they are usually admitted without issue.
Well, I guess, and I'm speaking from personal experience, I guess if they're looking into someone, the experience of going through the secondary inspection can apply to US citizens as well.
Absolutely. And this goes to any customs officer's desire to zealously advocate whatever the position is of the day and what their impression is of you coming over. And again, there's no Fourth Amendment rights there. So you're really at their mercy when you're coming in and being admitted. I've had US citizen clients anecdotally tell me, because it's not a regular occurrence, but I've had them ask me, why is it that I'm being pulled in a secondary inspection when I come back into the US now? I made a trip to Egypt, for example, and I had an extended period of stay there. This particular client, he's a filmmaker. So he was basically doing some work there, some filming, and has a project. So it was perfectly explainable. But, there's certain countries of interest, Cuba, Iran, North Korea. If you step foot there, it's just going to trigger a series of questions because of political reasons.
Which makes sense. I don't think that can be any political side or any presidency would make sense of doing that. And now I want to touch upon the actual immigration laws, because everybody's afraid of what can President Trump do. But I would like you to explain the difference between a change in the law and a change in the regulation.
Sure. So that's a very important distinction, and I think will put a lot of people at ease. So the president has very little ability, if any, to effectuate the law because the law is completely controlled by Congress. However, when it comes to regulations and enforcement of existing law, there's a lot of latitude. And the Trump administration has basically, in my opinion, been, for lack of a better term, the stress test of how much enforcement can bear with the existing laws on the book. They test all the time and see when things will get pushed to the Supreme Court to basically tell them no, which is very interesting. But in terms of declarations being made that, for instance, something was true yesterday, but no longer because the president decrees that from here on out, certain people aren't going to be allowed into the US for no reason at all, or whatever it is, that is not happening. However, there are small exceptions, but they're very limited and they're within the scope of the president's power. And the perfect example of this is temporary protective status, or TPS. So temporary protective status is basically a blanket asylum protection given to people who are seeking refuge from particular countries, and is given to them based on their passport and their country of origin and nothing else. So they, as individuals, don't have to prove that they have individually suffered persecution or anything like that. They get this protection solely on the basis of being from a specific place, because at any point in time, an executive branch decides that this particular country needs that, at least in the US, and they want to provide that. But because this is an executive or done by executive order, it can be removed immediately by the next administration if they would like. For example, the implementation by the Biden administration of the Venezuelan TPS, and then the removal, but now being challenged, but it's a bit up in the air with the Venezuelan. That's one example of something that has not had a very long life. However, we have another example of TPS, the Honduran and El Salvadorian TPS that was issued in the 90s due to an earthquake that happened at this point 30 years ago. There's still folks on TPS from that time and that were able to continue to renew it. Sometimes it's very political, and sometimes you're from a country that sort of flies under the radar and doesn't particularly move anything, so you can keep your status. The Ukrainian TPS is still in place, but it'll be very interesting to see what happens with that, with everything that's happening right now, with the negotiations for peace settlement and things like that. So, it's something that just you sort of have to keep an eye on.
What changes have you seen in the immigration courts and in USCIS since January of this year?
With USCIS specifically, I'm pretty happy to report that not much has changed, as opposed to the first Trump administration, when I would say that I felt, and again, anecdotally, and just speaking to other attorney colleagues, that it was much more difficult to get certain petitions approved, especially on the employment side. They got rid of the policy that past decisions were given deference, so you basically had to prove a case from zero, even if the person held that status. Fortunately, they've not gone back to that policy, which is good, and I've noticed that they are giving deference to past approvals, which I find kind of interesting. The family-based petitions aren't really affected. As a matter of fact, I guess depending on what city you process most things through, I've even seen some improvements in the actual wait times, but that might also be a symptom of getting out of the COVID era. It's becoming a lot more efficient to work and those kinds of things, so there isn't a huge backlog built up, unlike what's seen at the State Department level, where they have not staffed up the State Department any further to deal with the backlog since 2020. So they're really getting to cases when they can. And then you have, for instance, tourist visas for many countries that take a year to just get in front of an officer to get, which is absolutely ridiculous. But again, just kind of a function of the government and their resources. With respect to the courts, because we haven't done a whole lot of litigation in general this year, I can't really speak to it, but I do know just anecdotally, and because I have a few matters coming up, that unlike in the past when attorneys could sort of come on and off cases as long as they didn't prejudice the client, it seems that at least the New York immigration court, the judges are not allowing attorneys to leave the cases. So if you appear at a master calendar, you basically own that file until adjudication, which for many attorneys, it could mean an asylum case that can take years to hear. This is going to be someone that's going to be with their firm for quite a while. So that's something interesting that's happened, and just the incredible backlog that all of the rush to the southern border has created over the years, and they're still dealing with it at this moment. The fact that Customs and Border Patrol there on the southern border, they issue notices to appear in immigration court, but one thing to note is that Homeland Security controls customs, but the immigration court is under the Department of Justice, which in simpler terms means that they don't have the same computers. So unless one of those notice to appear ends up in DOJ's hands, there's many times that clients have showed up to their hearings and they're not on the calendar because of the sheer amount of people that there are, and because of the fact that they can't information share effectively. A lot of people have shown up to court and don't have a court date. So they check themselves in with the clerk, and then the clerk has to give this caseload to ICE, and then ICE has to decide whether or not to prosecute them. What happens is that a lot of those people that have the notices to appear but have been pushed and don't know what's going on are sort of left in a limbo. And what that means for them is that it may seem like they're okay because they're not in the system, but they're in limbo in the sense that because at least being in the system, and this is one of the reasons why people abuse the asylum process, is because you get work authorization while your case is pending, and the case could be pending for years. So it allows someone to have a valid social security number and work in the United States while all of this is happening. They're not able to do that if their case is in limbo or if their case is administratively closed. So they're just sort of in the streets until something else happens, and then who knows? So there's chaos to bring it all to a fine point.
I know well the process, and I remember I was going to court, and you're right, I wasn't allowed to withdraw from cases. And I remember I was going to court, and today was regulation, and tomorrow was a different thing. And it was real chaos back then. And I'm happy to hear that at least it's status quo more or less.
Status quo it is. Status quo it is. And honestly, I don't know if there will be a solution. I think that to a certain degree, there's a certain amount of incentive to keep the system somewhat broken to allow people to come and work in the US undocumented because it creates a permanent underclass of people who can be exploited and underpaid. And there's many industries in the US, especially in hospitality and construction, and there's others, but that rely on that labor to keep their costs down. So it's just the inconvenient truth that I don't know if either side is really going to go all the way, and if comprehensive immigration reform is just a political talking point for election season, and then after that, it sort of
Yeah.
disappears every time.
Dies
But
down.
that's
Yeah.
been the way it's always been in the United States, period, not just within the last few decades or whatever it is. There's always just sort of been this gap. So to
We spoke about the risks to citizens, but I want to ask you, what advice would you give immigration attorneys?
be cautious about the files that you decide to represent. And at the same time, I think that this is a moment for us to really stand up and do good work and protect individual clients. And the thing with immigration law is that even though, and this is a very strange contradiction, but even though it's the same law, the application to the individuals is very different. If you're from a certain country and you're sponsored by a company or a family member, depending on what country you're from, you can see yourself taking much longer to get your status than someone else, for example. And even cases that have very analogous fact patterns, because the officers always have this subjective element that they can use, they could decide them two completely different ways. So, I mean, my advice for immigration attorneys is always represent the person in front of you and not sort of an amorphous idea or law. You have to take whoever's in front of you and get them across and make them win and be successful, because it's very difficult to sort of look at people and decide, okay, you're an asylum case. You really just have to take a look and make your best judgment about what kind of fact pattern is going to keep this person here.
Yeah, I've done a few videos on explaining what I did wrong, what mistakes I've made for immigration attorneys to be aware. Because the combination of my mistakes and the overzealousness of the government, here I am.
Hmm.
I would like to ask you what an immigrant should do. Apply for something at this point in time, because President Trump term it's for another 3 years. Do they wait, or do they file, or what do they do if they are in the US?
I would suggest that there's going to be no one answer for that, but that every individual who is going to or is interested in making their best decision has to consult with an attorney, because an attorney will let them know the risks of whatever it is that they're deciding to do. If they're undocumented, it's a little bit easier to give the advice of, well, there's very little that you can do, but even in an undocumented position, there still could be options. So those should be discussed with an attorney, and then you understand the risk and whether or not you want to assume them, depending on what's happening. If you have to, for example, defend your case from a posture of being in immigration court and you have no choice, then you absolutely have to have an attorney representing you in court. So at least you have a chance. But this is not Home Depot. This is not do it yourself. That's very dangerous. It's almost like, would you perform surgery on yourself, even if it was something minor? The answer is going to be no. So why would you do your own legal work? And for people who sort of have the misnomer of, well, I'm just doing this very simple process and it's just filling out forms. If you make a mistake on those forms as an individual, you don't get to fix them. If an attorney makes a mistake on those forms, then you get to reopen your case based on their error. So it's an added level protection. It's the same concept of why buy insurance. but you also have a professional along to take care of your matters and make sure that your best interests are being represented and let you know the things that you don't know that you don't know. So that's my best advice.
And for our listeners, where can they find you in case they want to call you and talk to you?
Sure. So we are a firm located in New York City in Midtown Manhattan, just conveniently 1 block south of Penn Station. If by phone, we can be reached at 646-736-7782. And our website is www.velsip, that's V as in Victor, ELCIP.com. And we also have contact us section there as well if like to be contacted by email.
That's great. I will also link them in the description of the video. And now that we're actually at the end, there is one question that I ask every guest. And because our podcast is called Alive Again, the question is, what is one activity in your life that makes you feel more alive?
Feel more alive? I would say spending time with my kids doing anything. Because anytime I'm spending time with them, I do feel more alive. I feel like I'm living the experience for 3 different people. So it's myself again, and then through their eyes.
Thank you so much for your time, for your wisdom, for your advice. And I hope that people will be assured that they're safe in this country.
Thank you very much for having me again. It was a very interesting conversation.
Thank you. Our listeners, thank you for listening. And for more guests and more conversations, please subscribe and follow us. We'll see you next week. Bye bye.